Kia ora, everyone. Good morning in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and good afternoon, evening in Latin America. It is great to see you all here this morning. We are going to start with a karakia, and after the karakia, we'll start with a different activity that we have for you today. We are going to have brief conversations among ourselves, but
Oh,
let's,
Catherine's here.
Catherine is here. So I'm going to start with the karakia. Tu taua mai I runga, tu taua mai I raro, tu taua mai I roto, tu taua mai I waho, kia tau ai, te mauri tu, te mauri ora, ki te katoa, humie, huie, tai kie.
Yeah.
And actually, our Catherine is here, so I'll pass the word to her. Catherine, are you ready?
Yes. Good morning, everybody. Or good evening, where you are. You must excuse me. I've got a little bit of a cold this week, so my voice is a little bit not quite as strong as normal, but hopefully you'll be able to hear me quite clearly. So yes, nice to be back with you all again today, and I hope you've had a good week. Today we're going to be talking about trade negotiations, but I also thought what I would do for this session is take us back to just remind us all of the trade policy cycle in general, because trade negotiations is just one part of trade. From the perspective of the work of trade officials or of how we manage our trading relationships. And policy tends to give us a broader picture than just focusing in on negotiations. So today we're going to look at that sort of trade policy cycle, some strategies for negotiations, and then get you to do a bit of a group discussion to enhance your peer learning about these issues. I will share my slides now. So also this cycle is quite a useful one for considering some of the issues we touched on when I was with you last week, which was around stakeholder engagement. And so I will be just doing a little bit of a refresher on some of those points as well. Did anyone want to ask any questions, by the way, before we get started about any of the issues that we covered last time I was with you, which I think was a week ago on Thursday, where we talked about the private sector's interests in trade, the different ways that we can think about consultations and engagements with stakeholders. Did anyone have any questions that had come to mind after the lecture, or any experiences in the last week that have made them think of anything related to this topic? No? Okay, we'll get started then. And as I said last time, please just put your hand up if you do want to interrupt me. I have absolutely no problems with answering questions straight away rather than leaving them till the end. Okay, so we are going to talk a little bit about this, which is a representation of a trade policy or a policy cycle. This can differ quite a lot, and this is a generalized one which tries to touch upon a few of the broad stages that happen. But obviously it is going to vary depending on the topic, depending on the nature of your country's bureaucracy and structures for the making of different laws, regulations, and policies. But we will go through these steps, and you'll get a sort of a sense of how this looks, and then hopefully be able to start to think about how that applies in your own context. So agenda setting is quite an interesting one, and it's where this cycle starts. in fact, trade policy or policy making can start in different places, but agenda setting is about really identifying a problem and figuring out what type of issues you need to be responding to if you are tasked with working on a particular area. And quite frankly, in the area of trade, a lot of the agenda would be perhaps quite reactive because, as we mentioned last week, there are already existing rules of the game being put in place at the multilateral level with the World Trade Organization's work. At the regional level, we heard some great examples from you about the work that's underway in Mercosur as a customs union on a whole different range of areas. We would also have other regional groupings or arrangements that have their own agendas and their own issues that they are talking about. And so you're going to have components of a trade policy agenda that are very reactive to those different levels of conversations that are already happening. So it's not going to be necessarily something that you can always do from a proactive point of view. Here, of course, there is space to respond to the domestic needs of your own circumstances and constituencies. And we've got some interesting examples of this in the context of New Zealand's own trade policy evolution over the last 20 years. This is something I've been thinking about quite a lot at the moment because I'm writing a book chapter on the evolution of New Zealand's trade policy over 20 years. So it struck me when I was doing some writing for that in the last few days that there were a couple of particular turning points where we saw the New Zealand trade policy agenda having to adjust or having the opportunity, I guess, to become something quite different. And one of those was when we saw one of our political parties. We have a political system in New Zealand where we have two main parties, if you like, and an increasing number of then smaller parties around them. But we have two main parties, and they have traditionally been in a bipartisan agreement about the direction of trade policy. So it's been what we would call a relatively politically neutral topic at a political level in New Zealand. There hasn't been a lot of great divergence around how trade should be conducted over the last 20 years. There was a lot in the 1990s when we were first opening up our economy and reforming it, but more recently it's been a very settled issue area. But this changed at one point when there was a particular trade agreement called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, the predecessor to what we now have, which is the CTPPP. And we saw one of the parties in New Zealand vote against the adoption of that trade agreement in Parliament. And that was a bit of a wake-up call, I think, for trade officials and trade negotiators about the way they had been setting the agenda around trade issues. And so that was one turning point. And then another turning point was we had a legal case taken in a domestic setting in New Zealand by our Indigenous people, by the Maori people. And that was about a particular provision in a trade agreement that they felt breached their rights. And that was upheld, that view by the tribunal. And so that was another turning point in our trade policy that then required us to set different agendas. And so I'm giving you those examples just to really show that this process of agenda setting, it would be nice if it was as straightforward as perhaps the notes we've got on the slide there, where you can have a look at some evidence, you can gather some research, you can talk to people, and you can decide on what the issues are that you want to take forward. But the reality is that it's a much messier process of responding to conversations that are happening outside of your countries at the international, regional level, and also domestic issues as they arrive. So that's agenda setting. And then uh, the second part we had in this particular representation of policy making was formulation of the policies. And that's where a lot of you might get involved, including if you are in different agencies within government, where you, for example, dealing with SPS issues or maritime concerns and so on, then part of your role may be that formulation of policy. And policy can be formed in different ways. It can look like different things as well in terms of how it is taken forward. And that's really a very country specific type of process, whether there is consultations, the work that's done to draft documents that will be very specific to your own environments. And then as will policy adoption, which is the next one. It may be that, for example, you can have policies that are simply guiding documents within your trade departments, and they don't need to go through any other processes to be approved or to be adopted. But if it's a regulation or a piece of legislation, for example, then that's going to have a whole different process, as we all know. So these are some of the considerations. What I think has been a really big shift that I've seen, certainly in New Zealand in the last, I want to say maybe 3 to 5 years, is that there is much more focus now on these last two steps that we've included here in this policy cycle representation, and that is on one, trade implementation of trade policy, and two, monitoring and evaluation and trying to understand the impact of policy. These, I think, have perhaps not got as much attention in the past necessarily, as the agendas have been quite robust in terms of the number of issues that officials have just had to be dealing with and responding to. There hasn't been an awful lot of time or energy or resources made available for these phases. But what we're finding now, certainly in our case here in New Zealand, is that we have negotiated a wide range of trade rules with our partners in the context of the WTO, free trade agreements, plurilateral arrangements, cooperative mechanisms like APEC, for example. But what we really need to be doing is making sure that all of those rules, all of those issues that we've been putting in place are in fact being used, are in fact useful to those that we spoke about last week who are doing the trade. So this is where we have a lot of the interface with the business community, with other stakeholders being really necessary. So there is, for example, in our case, in the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, there's a new unit that has been set up in the last 2 years called the Implementation and Enforcement Unit, which is a new part of our trade bureaucracy here. And it has been dedicated to these activities around promoting free trade agreements, making sure that we understand whether they are being utilized in any way by traders, whether they are in fact useful in terms of changing the dynamics between countries. And this requires collecting data, establishing a baseline, as we've said there, under monitoring, making sure that we understand where we started before we had these policies or agreements in place, and then we can continue to track trends on their utilization and implementation as we go. So this is a really, as I say, important aspect of policy making of any kind, because it's also that feedback loop that helps make those connections into the other parts of the process that we've already covered. So through understanding implementation and then monitoring the impact of these rules and policies, we're able to identify whether there are new issues. So agenda setting, whether there's new issues we need to address, whether there's gaps that we have in our existing policy, or whether we need to perhaps tweak or amend, go back and look at the formulation of our policies and agreements through reviews and so forth. So this is, as I say, very important as part of a broader feedback loop on policy making. And trade policy is really hard to distill down into just one sort of definition. This is something the World Bank works on, which looks at formulation of measures, rules, regulations that govern trade, but then also the formulation of measures and activities that reduce the rules, that unduly restrict trade. So you've got a sort of a two-sided view there of what could be included in trade policy. But what's really important, I think, when we're talking about policy and interactions, is to think about trade not just as a standalone area, but as part of what contributes to a much greater set of objectives and broader policy aims of a government, of an administration. And this is where I think trade has become a lot more recognized for its complexities than when perhaps we were negotiating rounds under the GATT. We now know that, as we said last week, trade involves many different actors within a government, not just when we're thinking about non-state actors at all, but just even within governments. And so the development of these policy responses and all of those steps that I just went through in the cycle can be very much influenced and dependent on the relationships that take place between different government agencies. And I was just sort of just doing a bit of a brainstorm when I was thinking about this topic and put down a few of the types of questions that I think can be answered by trade policies. They can be about your actual makeup of your trade, what it is that you've got from a supply side perspective. What are you making within your economy? Who are you trading that with? Who would you like to be trading that with in terms of diversifying over time? But also, as I say, much more forward-looking issues need to be considered around how trade contributes to broader objectives for economic development, industrial development, perhaps, for matters related to energy and conservation. You're going to hear a little bit later today about issues related to food and food security creates opportunities for example, groups of people, particularly within our societies. So how does trade fit within our broader social objectives, for example, of promoting the rights and opportunities of our Indigenous business communities or women-led businesses? So you've got a whole lot of other broader questions that I think can be considered when you're talking about trade policy. Did want to make one observation about some of the thinking at an academic level, but also at a very practical level. And this comes back to a point that we talked a little bit about last week. And that is that we have very much shifted in our appreciation and understanding of trade a long time ago, really. This is not new, to the understanding that trade is conducted by firms and not by countries. So that's that shift from a macro to a micro level. There was obviously a long-held view that you could put in place the broad trade architecture for the free movement of goods and services, and that you would then have that trickle-down effect of positive contributions to the broader economic outcomes of the countries participating in free trade. I think that's very much obviously been debunked in a lot of circumstances. And so there's a growing body of work that tries to focus on really understanding how trade is conducted more at that micro level by firms, how they make decisions about trade, how they interact with each other. So all of our understanding now about global value chains, about supply chain connections, is a much more about really appreciating that trade is not as straightforward as perhaps a very basic comparative advantage model would have you think. And so the focus has shifted really to understanding these actors at a firm level, and then thinking about also complementary policies that are critical to make sure that trade can achieve positive outcomes, or that we at least mitigate negative outcomes of some trade rules. And this is, I think, where research has become quite complicated, and where there is normally big gaps in the data we have available, or how we can use the data we have available, because there's privacy and confidentiality concerns about anything that may become too associated with specific businesses. But we also just have this real outdated, I think, often missing completely understanding of our own traders. And this is something that can make it really difficult to undertake and develop trade policy that is based on that grassroots understanding of what's going on with trade on a day-to-day level. Again, this was something we spoke quite a bit about last week in terms of engaging with the private sector. But I did just want to make that note here as well. So trade negotiations is a particular pillar, if you like, or particular aspect of trade policy. It's when we get together and start to talk to our trading partners in different forums. And this can be in the context of larger multilateral negotiations, but more often than not, it's in the context of either bilateral free trade agreement conversations, or in small groups at regional levels where we really see negotiations taking place these days. The WTO, in terms of its negotiating capacity, I think it's exhausted its ability to make extensive new rules. It's been very difficult to do so since the WTO came into being. And we talked a little bit about the example of the trade facilitation agreement last time. There's also been the fisheries subsidies work, but that has proven to be not as successful as I think we would have liked, and has shown again the challenges of making those multilateral negotiations work. When I worked in the WTO context, the area where we would be able to really engage in negotiations on an active basis was when we were dealing with the accessions of new members to the organization, and you would have the opportunity to participate in the working groups on the accessions processes of those new members coming into the organization. So that's still one area that is there for those countries that are in the process of going through the accession negotiations, where they have to work with all of the existing WTO member states to be approved. But as I say, most trade negotiations these days take place in the context of bilateral small group processes. And they can have all sorts of different end goals, if you like. It can be that sometimes those negotiations are not really about coming to some strict conclusion, or forming new sets of rules, or agreeing on concessions that are going to be legally binding. Maybe that the goals are just about cooperation and deepening interactions between countries involved in them. But understanding what your end goals are is a very important part of the negotiating process. Setting those out at the beginning and hopefully having some level of mutual acceptance of what those goals are. But then it's important, once you know what your goals are, to think about how you're going to achieve them. And that can be through an overarching strategy, which could be in some instances broken down into smaller component parts of different tactics. So we are going to talk a little bit today about a sort of a way to think about negotiations, as well as an example that I picked up this week from Mexico. And then we'll have a group discussion about negotiations as well. So this is one way of, I guess, defining or looking at some of the different negotiation goals that might be there. As I say, it may be that your goals for the negotiations are actually things like cooperative engagements that can lead to mutual gain for all involved. So those kind of cooperative goals that you see there on the far side. Much more in the end, I think, of what we see at the moment from some participants in the global trading system, you've got these more soul-focused, hard interest-driven approaches to negotiations, where you have aggressive goals, which would be, in some cases, I think, goals that are intended to actually undermine, or in some circumstances damage even, the other side that you are negotiating with, or your partner, or in the kind of contestation of aggressive goals, you'd probably describe the other side as an opponent. So it would be very much an us and them type of mentality. Linked in some ways to self-centered goals, which are those that really are about achieving your own interests. So it's driven from a very realist perspective, very much about pursuing hard interests and thinking about what those goals are, not considering either broader public interests of the international community or your region or the group, but more about just that sole focus on what's good for me. So that's that kind of aggressive, self-centered goals. Competitive goals, I think, are much more about an appreciation that both sides in the process have goals. But if you are trying to approach a negotiation to make sure that you gain as much as possible, then that would be a type of competitive goal. And then there's defensive goals, which are probably quite self-explanatory, where you've perhaps had your hand forced in terms of being in this process of negotiation, and you're really just trying to avoid a particular outcome or defend what your own interests are against often aggressive goals or self-centered goals from the other side. So these are one way that we can think about negotiation goals. There is an awful lot of approaches to negotiations out there. I've just picked a few that I think are helpful from a trade policy point of view. And obviously, in most circumstances, any kind of negotiation is going to have some kind of combination of these types of objectives, where, for example, there may be self-centered goals that you want to achieve in the process as a participant, but you understand that the other side is going to have their own goals, so the outcomes may be much more competitive or balanced. And then there will be areas perhaps where you are fully defensive and cannot make concessions and want to simply protect those sectors. So if we think about, for example, you know, Japan's rice tariffs, that would be a fully defensive goal, something that they just don't necessarily talk about, they don't engage in when it comes to negotiations, because it's a sector of deep cultural and national importance. So they simply have a very defensive goal in that area. And I'm sure we can all think of examples at the moment that are much more about aggressive, self-centered goals, but we'll talk about that shortly. So in most negotiations at an international level or taking place between states, you're going to have a combination of concerns that may be represented in different levels of goals, if you like, because it's not always just going to be about a very technical outcome. There's always going to be something about the relationship between the parties. And that's particularly the case when you're thinking about regions where you've got long histories, where perhaps the countries participating in the negotiations together are in fact geographical neighbors, or where you have shared cultures, or even shared industries, or shared value chains. So you've got certainly not just the understanding of goals from a technical, substantive point of view, but I think it's always very important to make sure that goals for a negotiation are also understood in terms of the relationships. And that could also be relationships with your domestic constituencies again. So what we were talking about earlier in terms of those broader stakeholder interests, your relationship goals in a negotiation could well be about managing your domestic stakeholder groups and their own interests as much as it is about negotiating with other countries or parties. So that's what makes negotiations quite complex in this space. So there's a matrix here which looks at trying to present some of these issues in a very very distilled 4-quadrant approach, where if you think about your different goals, your substantive goals, what they might be in terms of your technical outcomes, and then your relationship goals in terms of how important it is for you to maintain different levels of interaction with the other side. And then we can think about 4 very broad main strategies in this regard. So, for example, if your substantive outcome is actually not important enough for you, and you really don't actually have much of a relationship with the other parties involved, then you may not even just want to participate in the negotiations at all. And that's that first strategy there of avoidance. It's just not worth it to negotiate. But if it is worth it, you have got some substantive outcomes that you want to achieve, but perhaps you don't necessarily have existing relationships issues, then the competitive strategy or the competition strategy there is about really, I think, thinking about negotiations in terms of what you can get out of them. So it's sort of that slightly self-centered approach. It's about identifying very clearly what those substantive outcomes are, and then just going for it in terms of the negotiations, because you don't have those constraints of other more complex political factors related to their relationships. The collaborative approach, I guess, is where everybody ideally wants to sit within a international relations context. And that is about where you're talking to partners and negotiating with them because you have substantive interests, but you also have important relationships you're trying to maintain. And there you're looking for a win-win outcome, to use a different sort of phraseology. So you're looking for a positive sum game through strategies that are much more collaborative. Accommodative is the other one there, and that's where perhaps you're talking to a partner where you've got a very strong existing relationship, But the issue that you're negotiating on is not actually that substantively important. So you can be a lot more prepared to give things up and save the relationship rather than focus on the substantive outcomes. So that's one sort of matrix approach of different strategies that I wanted to share here. And it's actually quite a good, very broad brush way of thinking, I think, about those two levels of goals, the substantive and the relational. And then if we start to just think beyond that, beyond those four very broad categories of negotiation strategies, gosh, you can come up with hundreds and hundreds of examples of different strategies. And so I've included a bit of a list here of a few where it can be approached in terms of thinking through your concession level. So what are you prepared to give up on in terms of the issues that are on the table? What are there concessions you can make from the very beginning at first to kind of set the scene for the negotiations? Are there areas where you will make no concessions whatsoever? Or are there areas where it comes down to them being in a category of tactics where, for example, it's an issue that you know is going to be difficult, but that you leave towards the end because it could be a way to break a deadlock or to get some kind of overall outcome. So when I think about the negotiations that took place between New Zealand and the European Union on a free trade agreement, an example of an area where New Zealand had a strategy of only making deadlock breaking concessions was in the area of geographical indications. This was an issue. I don't know if some of you know what geographical indications are. They are the names or the terms used for products that are associated with particular geographical locations or regions. So the most well-known example is champagne, which comes from a particular place in France, and where you can only call a sparkling wine champagne if it comes from France, is Champagne region. And so this is an issue that New Zealand has disagreed with the EU on for many, many decades, because New Zealand's position was largely that these geographical indications were being used as a protectionist policy by the EU to shut out products from other countries. And so it was one of those issues that from the very beginning of the negotiations, New Zealand stood quite firm on not wanting to make any concessions about geographical indications. But as the negotiations progressed, it became obvious that the strategy being adopted by New Zealand in the negotiations was actually to use geographical indications as a deadlock breaking concession in the end. So it became the issue that was left to the last phase of the negotiations and enabled an agreement to be reached in many ways, because New Zealand was able to make a concession on geographical indications and agree to protect some names, and that allowed the EU to sign up to the rest of the agreement as well. So that's just one example of a way these strategies can play out. There are, of course, strategies that you'll see from some actors perhaps that show that their goals in the negotiation are actually not about reaching an agreement at all. This is something we see playing out in the multilateral environment often, I would suggest, where you have some countries that participate in processes of negotiation where it becomes quite obvious that really they have no intention of being part of an agreement on rules of any kind in that particular area. It's one of the reasons I think we saw the joint statement initiatives come up in the WTO environment, where you were trying to move ahead just with a group of countries who are like-minded about an issue and committed to actually reaching some kind of level of agreement. Because in the broader multilateral context of the WTO, it had not been possible to do that, as there were some players or members who had a strategy of participating in conversations, but with an aim of not actually reaching any level of agreement in the end. So that can also be some kind of strategy you'll see playing out, as I say, particularly at a multilateral level in many ways. So these are just some few examples that I've put there. There are many, many different strategies going by many different names. And I'm going to ask you in a minute to think about some examples from your own experience of how you could describe the strategies you've encountered in negotiations or seen. And really, the selection or the identification of these strategies is about considering a few different things. What is the power balance in the negotiations? That is going to be a massive factor often, is about actually how much sway or influence do each of the different parties hold. And we see that happening in trade all the time, because in trade, you have this quite quantifiable way to identify power by putting a percentage on the amount of global trade that a particular country has. And that has resulted in, for example, the formation of things like small groups, the P4, the Quad, the green rooms, even the G20 is an example of where you've had a configuration put together on the basis of a sort of an assessment of power, if you like, in economic terms. So there's different ways of thinking about power, and it just isn't always economic might or muscle, but it is important to think about that power balance within the different actors. It may be that there are specific situations in some countries that need to be taken into account in terms of those domestic interests in the negotiations, as I was saying. So I've seen this quite often in African countries, where you might have particular sectors controlled by certain parts of the society, and that can have an influence on the way that that country then negotiates. Another example in this case where you'd have to be conscious of the domestic situation of a party would be if you're negotiating with New Zealand, and you have to be aware that our context has a treaty, Te Tiriti of Waitangi, which is the Treaty of Waitangi, and that is the founding document between our government and the Maori, and that forms a very important part of our situation and how we negotiate on certain issues. So if you didn't understand that and you were negotiating with New Zealand, you might get surprised by some of the positions and requests being made. So they're just a few examples of what I meant there by situation of the parties. Boundaries. It may be that from the outset you can narrow down a negotiation because you understand the upper and lower boundaries from different actors, and that can be really helpful and can help move things along quite quickly. Individual negotiators can be such a big influence on the outcomes of particular processes, where so not only often is it about those choices around strategy and approach and understanding goals, but it can be about the skills, the relationship that can happen between individual negotiators based on their personalities. That can really be a make or break situation in a lot of negotiations. And so you perhaps in your own context can think about examples of negotiators that you've met in your experiences where you've really clicked with that person. And that can make a huge difference in processes of getting agreement. And then thinking through the process itself or the rhythm of negotiations is quite an interesting exercise sometimes to do, because negotiations do go through phases, and there are often different points where you'd want to be willing to adapt or reframe your strategy, thinking about those different ideas that we had there and examples of strategies. So that's just a few additional points I wanted to flag. We're going to break up into groups shortly, but I did just want to share one example that I picked up earlier this week, which I thought was really interesting. I was attending a event in Wellington on Tuesday, the New Zealand Institute for International Affairs, which is one of our think tanks platforms in New Zealand we have for discussing a whole range of international issues, had a conference, and one of the presenters there was from Mexico. So I know we've got some colleagues on the line here. His name was Juan Carlos Baker Pineda. I hope I've said that correctly. I think he's a former trade official from within the Mexican system, if I'm not mistaken, and now he's associated with a company called Ainsley Consultants. But he made an interesting presentation about his perception, and this was just his personal perception, so not the Mexican government, but how he characterized the approaches that Mexico considers or has used in its conversations underway with the United States around trade issues. And I thought it was quite an interesting way to think about a concrete example we have at the moment, where just about all countries around the world are being forced, if you like, or coerced into some kind of level of negotiation with the US about tariffs, about trade, about understanding what the implications are going to be as the United States moves forward with different changes to its own trade policy. And Mexico obviously is in a situation of being, extraordinarily connected through trade with the United States. I don't think we can kind of overstated enough in some ways based on the figures and things I have seen, which is, the amount of trade between the US and Mexico is about 4 times New Zealand's total trade, for example. So it's really a very, very close and important economic partnership there. And so what Juan Carlos was talking about was he used 4 C's to describe his assessment of the strategy Mexico's had with its engagements with the US. And there's overlap between these C's, as you'll see, but I thought it was quite an interesting way to talk about strategy and to line it up with the examples we've been giving. He said that in his view, Mexico is taking a multi-prong approach to the engagements with the US, and that it's, for example, trying to identify those areas where it can continue to cooperate and reach mutually beneficial agreement with the US on certain issues. Where there are issues, perhaps where it can also converge was another of the C's he gave, where they can perhaps begin to move to one another and then move into that phase of cooperation. And then in the middle, there were the 2 C's he spoke to about challenge, where it's just not possible. It's not in Mexico's interests to agree to some of the demands being made. And then an interesting C I thought that he gave was contrast, where he used this to explain how Mexico is also looking at diversifying its partnerships as part of its strategy and aligning with others where possible. So these were just this is my notes of his presentation. So just to put a disclaimer there as well, is my notes of his presentation where he gave these 4 C's as a way of describing the current approach of Mexico in its conversations with the US on trade. And what I also took from his presentation was talking a lot about being flexible and efficient in our strategy making, and making sure we're in positions to be able to reassess, redesign, and redeploy with his 3 R's, if you like, different approaches as necessary as we encounter different changes from our trade partners. So I thought that that was quite a timely intervention that I picked up on from Juan Carlos on Tuesday, and I wanted to share it here. And then ask you to go into your groups for 10 minutes to have a bit of a conversation about these topics, to think a little bit about your own country's trade policy, what it looks like, where is it contained, is it a politically neutral issue in your country, or does it change and evolve every time governments move? That's a really important thing to understand. How is it monitored and adapted, and what stakeholders are involved in that process? And then if you can think about some of the key issues and maybe using the environment created by the Trump administration around trade policy and trade negotiations at the moment as a touch point, if you'd like, what sort of different strategies or approaches can you see, either in your own context and experience, or perhaps just observing what's going out in the world? So it's a bit of a free-ranging discussion today, more to get you thinking a little bit about your own situation and how this applies, but also to get you exchanging with a couple of your peers in the groups. So Juanita, Suzanne, hand over to you to break us up into some groups for 10 minutes of discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. So we'll be assigning you to your breakout rooms now.
And I'll share these questions to the rooms so
Thanks.
the scholars will have them.
Thank you. We go and check if they can see the slide now.
How are you guys this morning? I hope my voice is not too blocked up.
No, I'm sorry. You're doing amazingly well.
Oh, good.
I was doing a workshop with some postdocs last week, and my voice, I'd been sick the week before.
Mm.
My voice just gave out.
Ah, yeah.
Like about 10 minutes before the end, I was just like, read the slide.
No, it feels a bit like that in my throat, but I think I'm going to be all right. I'll have a chat with each other. If you wanted to raise some points and you didn't quite get there, then let's hear from you now as well. So please feel free to raise any observations or comments in response to those questions, even if you didn't quite get a chance to do that in your groups, because that did feel like quite a short time frame. I'm sorry. Perhaps I didn't quite get that right today. But let's get some feedbacks, any questions, any observations that you would like to make. Should we start with group one?
So, room one, Beatriz, Ezequiel, Jessica, Jesus, Maria, Paula, Virginia. Anyone from group one to share with the main group?
Okay, I can do it.
Mhm.
Okay, my group was integrated by Suriname, Chile, Argentina, Mexico, and Colombia, I think. And we couldn't cover the 4 questions, unfortunately. We ran out of time, but we can conclude that all of us think that there is not a unique document or guideline in relation with trade policy. It is divided in different documents, or maybe it's easier if you can analyze by sectors. And apart from that, in general, we can say that there is a constant in our foreign policy, that is the possibility of integrate and incentivate the participation of each country in the different integration and regional processes like Mercosur or the Andean community, etc. And especially Mexico with the United States. This shows that although there is, of course, the government's change, the continuity of the participation in this kind of agreement shows at least good results. That's why the countries still want to participate and not break the rules in relation with trade, at least at the basic level.
Okay, great. No, there are 2 really important observations. Thanks, Maria. That often there's not just one trade policy, but it's, as you say, found across different documents, different sectors, different government departments, perhaps even. And then I really appreciate that observation that regional integration has been a constant. That importance of having those regional structures is something that that doesn't seem to be interfered with by different governments, because it's a widely accepted benefit, if you like, to participate in those regional structures. So yeah, that's really helpful. Did anyone else from group one want to add anything? Our Mexican colleagues, what did you think of Juan Carlos's
I would like to add something.
Yeah.
May I?
Yes.
If I'm not mistaken, I remember we talked about the monitoring and stakeholders, and in general, in each country, we delegate of this task or the primary monitor to the Minister of the Commerce for each country. So this activity we delegated to order to contact or constantly with the other stakeholder like civil society, indigenous group, and environment institution remain including these voices in crucial to ensure equity and align with broader sustainable and innovation goals. I guess this is an important thing to include in the discussion.
Yeah. Thanks, Jesus. And do you think that monitoring kind of leads to changes and adaptation over time as well? So if something comes up from that process, do you see it coming back as a feedback?
Yeah, as a feedback, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. Excellent. Anyone else from group one want to add anything? If not, we'll ask room 2.
So Alejandra, Andrea, Elena, Jessica, Cuellar, and Sabine, and Miguel.
Well, I'll speak about Brazil, and then please, colleagues, speak about their countries. But in general, Brazil doesn't have a national politics of international trade. It is done in many platforms that the public sector invites the private sector to discuss the benefits or the problems with some specific trade. We also have politics of commercial defense of Brazilian products. In general, the industry is a very protected sector here in Brazil, and the agribusiness sector in general is very good at selling themselves. We also have agricultural attaches in many, many countries, and we have a great history of diplomacy where Brazil puts up to discuss tax reductions and bilateral agreements between countries. So if I remember well, we are discussing the an unique politic of international trade, but we also have an internal politics to develop the exporting culture in small and medium business in general. So this is what we are doing right now, and maybe planning to have a unified politic.
Excellent. Thanks, Elena. I mean, a very good point about what you described as sort of defensive approaches of some of the industries in Brazil, and especially the power, if you like, of the agricultural sector, which I can imagine if you were to be negotiating with that sector, you'd need to be very conscious of, because, you know, we heard last week as well about the strength of organization that we see in a lot of countries of farmers, of agricultural companies. So yes, that can really sway the power balance. It's exactly the same in New Zealand to a certain extent, where we also have a similar history of being an agriculturally strong economy, and therefore there is quite a lot of power that sits with still that part of our economy. Anyone else from Group 2 want to add from their side to the points from Brazil?
Sure, thanks.
Hi.
I would like to go ahead, Andrea.
Go ahead, Alejandra. And then me.
No, I was just going to make reference that we briefly answer all of the questions for the countries of our colleagues. So we were discussing about Brazil, El Salvador, Belize, Suriname, and Colombia. I would just briefly mention about the case of Colombia. And in our case, we recently developed the foreign trade policy for the period 2022-2026, which is mainly focused on 5 commitments. The first one is attracting foreign investment for sustainable development and energy transition. The second one, the internationalization of territories and a productive and exporting culture. The third one is called the Global South, that is mainly integration with Latin America, the Caribbean, Asia, and Africa. The fourth one is called active and proactive multilateralism, and the last one is fair and balanced internationalization. It is monitored by the Ministry of Trade, but however, we also have a group that is called High Council for Foreign Trade, which is the advisory body of the national government in all aspects related to foreign trade and the competitiveness of the country's companies.
Okay, great. Oh, so that's very extensive sounding framework, to tell you the truth. Is this something that's renewed every, what was it, 4 years? 4 years?
Yeah, I would say so. I'm not sure that in every single government there is one policy, but I think we have had some before, but in this particular case, it's for the 4 years period, 2022-2026, this one at least.
Excellent. Oh, no, I mean, and that's always helpful, quite frankly, if you're working in trade, that somebody has put everything down on one piece of paper. So yeah, that's a great example. Did anyone from the rest of the group want to add anything, or can we go to Oh, Andrea, yes, of course. Yeah.
To share my participation. In our case of El Salvador, yeah, we have a national trade policy for trade and investment that is from 2020 to 2050. And through this policy that we have is like our route that we have to take as a country in order to develop our export in the future. So in this case, it's commitment and it's leadership by the Ministry of Economy, but also by the presidency, that is the Secretary of the Investment and Trades, as I remember. And we usually have 2 meetings at the year in order to monitorizing this policy and in order that it is good, all the things that we're making right now, and in order to have that goal in the future. So in these policies also participate are the private sector because we have a good relationship with them. So it's important to us always have a feedback from them. And in order that if we both are in the same line in order to have the same goal at the future. So it's something that I like to add.
Interesting. And I mean the time frame you've got there of 30 years, is it? That's quite interesting too. It's going to be a changing 30 years, I would say. So I'm sure there'll be a need for regular reviews. Excellent. Great. Thank you. Group 3. Who have we got?
So Janina, Carla, Mariana, Nikolai, Ericles, and Wilmer Azusa.
Anyone from that group?
May I?
Steve.
Yes. So I talk about Brazil, and I told my colleagues in the group that the Brazil there is no specific trade policy here, but we have a lot of laws and legislation regulation that guide us in trade international, in specific area like agriculture. That, in my opinion, it's the most important sector in the Brazil, and Brazil is very protective for this in this sector area because we need to try expand your exportation to other countries. And about your stakeholders that work with with these goals, I told them that government and private sector work together for achieve goals in many cases. And yes, I think that's it. And I will leave my colleagues bring any contribution in this discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yes, I've had experience of working with the private sector in Brazil, and they are incredibly well organized and effective, I think. So I can imagine they keep the trade officials and the agricultural officials on their toes. There is some very strong business associations in Brazil. So yes, thank you for those observations. Also about the range of sort of laws and regulations that perhaps you need to be aware of when you're thinking about trade policy. Anyone else from that group want to add anything? Or yes, Nikolai.
Hello, good afternoon.
Hi.
Hi, yes. So my input in this particular case, I shared what approaches Belize has in place. Well, of course, we know that Belize is a very small economy, and it promotes exports, protecting local industries. And one of the approaches we have is engaging in regional or international trade organizations. And there was a question of how do we monitor the policies that we have. And so I gave an example of something that I'm familiar with, which is called the Common External Tariff or the CET. And what that is it's a tariff that the CARICOM, which Belize is a part of, it's a tax, right, on goods that come from outside of the CARICOM region. And so its main purpose is to protect the local industries of the CARICOM member states, and making the imported goods more expensive, especially when we have the goods to supply. So I give an example of Trinidad and Tobago wanting sugar, for example. Then the CARICOM Secretariat would share to all the member states saying Trinidad and Tobago has sugar, and they want us to suspend that tariff for them to get it from a country like Brazil. In this case, Belize would say, hi, we produce sugar, so we can provide this, we can supply this. And that's what I deal with. And so I'll just turn my camera on because I gave an example. I gave that example because here I have today's request of suspension of those of the tariff, and it's quite a lot. So that's just one example of the policies that Belize exercises. And yeah, that's my input. Thanks.
Interesting. Yeah. Common external tariffs. They're very difficult, huh? They are a very interesting part of a trade policy. So thanks, Nicolai, for raising it, because you know, I think it shows you some of the challenges also of working in a customs union where you have that common external tariff, and it has to be accommodating of a wide range of different interests from different countries participating in the union. And yeah, you know, there's this theoretical idea that regional integration progresses through different steps, and a customs union is one of those steps. But it's not a particularly easy step for any region to get operational. So it's really interesting that you gave that example of the day-to-day challenges that you have between the CARICOM countries, and how you have to work out your different interests. Thank you for that. Mariana?
Hi. I just wanted to add something to what Maria said in the first group. I mean, Argentina, I agree, has been constant always in willing to participate in regional agreements or regional groups of countries working together. But what I think is that we have some difficulties in sustaining one look regarding one perspective regarding international trading, since Argentina has changes of policies as we change the governments. I mean, different political parties in the government mean different kind of measures, like financials, withholdings, and so on. And I think that sometimes makes it more difficult to approach our goal because of the changing.
Exactly. And I think that you wouldn't be alone in that experience. I mean, thinking about New Zealand, as I said, I would describe us as having had a fairly politically neutral trade policy overall, but where we see the changes often, but when a new government comes in, is it sometimes around specific sectors, for example.
Right.
So yeah, as you mentioned, you maybe have seen it in finances or the financial sector. We saw at the beginning of our current government's term that they suddenly took a very different position on fisheries issues than previous governments. And so it was quite a specific sector shift. So not at that broad level where there seems to be quite a lot of agreement amongst different political actors. But yeah, certainly I think you can see those changes coming through, and that can be difficult, Yeah, as an official. I do not envy US trade officials.
No.
You know, who are sitting out there at the moment, and perhaps in different countries, and trying to explain some of these things. I mean, I'm sure some of you interact with them in your own countries, and that just can't be an easy job right now. So yes, thank you for sharing that experience, because I think it is important to understand. Group 4.
Juliana, Eder, Enrico, Gabriel, Marcia, and William Cortés.
Yeah, I'll start talking on behalf of Group 4. So Group 4 was me, Eder, Juliana from Brazil, Marcia from Grenada, William from Peru, and Gabriel from Colombia. So we started talking about political neutrality on trade, and we pretty much agreed that most countries in South and Central America are not very politically neutral when they are negotiating. So it depends a lot on the government in the moment. Except for Peru, according to William, there is a larger political neutrality on the negotiations by the Peruvian side. But the diplomatic body of the country, especially in Brazil, usually acts as a buffer. So there is a permanent diplomatic body that is, of course, affected by the government, but they are very they have a large experience in negotiating, and they're very pragmatic usually. Besides the political view of the government at the moment. About Grenada, Marcia also mentioned about that most negotiations are on regional levels. So in CARICOM, as in CARICOM, most countries also do not have a specific trade policy, and especially agreeing with Elena and Pericles that also spoke about Brazil. It depends. There's no specific trade policy, and it depends a lot on the Minister of Foreign Relations relation with the stakeholders. As we didn't have much time to discuss about examples, but I was just mentioning that curiosity that Brazil negotiates with some countries. There are some untouchable topics, like, for example, Brazil with Colombia, the untouchable topic is coffee. So both sides are very defensive. Ecuador and Brazil are defensive about bananas. So just some examples I would like to remember. And yeah, if anyone wants to add anything.
Thanks, Enrico. I think that's a really interesting point about the buffer of your diplomatic structure and your institution, if you like, of bureaucracy that hasn't been affected so much by those changes at a political level, and that can really help with some degree of stability in trade policy and interactions. So I think that's a really great point about that importance of institutional strength when we think about these issues. So thank you for raising that, and also your examples of untouchable topics. I mean, that's a really good example of a negotiating strategy that I think a lot of countries do have, where they are just not prepared to put certain topics on the table. Yeah, it can happen between neighbors, as you say. It very much. I'm interested in bananas because bananas was one of those topics that was actually quite untouchable at a multilateral level for a long time as well. It was a big challenge between the EU and the African, Caribbean, Pacific group in their processes and negotiations. Sugar is another example, as we heard from our colleague from Belize, another one that can cause quite a lot of tension and often be a really tough topic. So yes, really helpful examples. Thank you. Juliana?
Yes, I would like just to add because we didn't have time to discuss that in our group. I work in trade negotiations in Brazil, about this question about the strategies. What I see is there are different strategy for each chapter that are negotiated in the trade agreement. For example, I am involved in the trade negotiation of trade and gender chapter, and
Yes.
the trade and gender chapter, they are more collaborative. So we discuss cooperation and how it works, and it's at least it's a light environment. And of course, I see my colleagues they have another issues to deal, and yeah, I think it changes the topic. And so another thing that you asked to other group about if we change in the middle, because for example we are mostly responsible for implementing the trade and gender chapter from Brazil and Chile, just an example. And the trade and gender chapter is at least so general, the cooperation activities, that we can change our needs there. So there's a area of cooperation that talks about women and STEAM. And before we didn't know what we are going to do about it. And then in the end, we found some activities that we can fit there. But because of the moment also, we thought it was fit to this time. So maybe in this point, in this chapter, I don't know, I don't have deeper knowledge in other chapters.
Yeah, no, but that's an excellent example, as you say, of how there can be different strategies within the same negotiation, but in different areas. So that's a great example of collaboration in the gender chapters of agreements. And I'm personally quite interested in whether the greater presence of women in negotiating teams shifts the use of certain strategies as well. But that's a whole nother subject about
Good question. Like, yeah, like I don't know, 5 years ago, I was in a negotiation team in another chapter, in another FTA, and I was like, there were like, I don't know, 15 men and just 3 women. So, but now it looks like a little bit different.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
we
So
are,
very interesting to know whether that dynamic shifts the way that we negotiate.
yeah.
Yeah, but that's a whole nother research topic and question, I think. But
Yeah.
that I have my own views on as having certainly when I started in the WTO, it was extremely male, to put it very mildly, in the 1990s. So it was a very male environment. So it would be very interesting to see how things have shifted because of that as well. Thank you. Thanks for that example of collaboration. So my time is well and truly up now. We've gone a little bit over, but it was really useful to hear all of those observations from your own experiences and the different countries in the region. Where there are sort of synergies around things like the importance of those collaborations that you have within regional groups and so on. Very interesting. The importance of working with the private sector came through a lot as well. So I hope that was a stimulating conversation for you this afternoon, and that perhaps you can use some of those ideas to think about how your own trade policy role fits into the bigger picture, and how you can think about the approaches that are taken to negotiations of different kinds as well. I will be back with you next week, I think, the final session. Actually, I often have the privilege of doing the final session where we try to bring together a whole lot of the different ideas and issues that you've been talking about throughout the course. So I will see you then and leave you with Juanita and Suzanne and your next lecturer. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Catherine.
much.
We'll see you next week. So yes, we will have a 5-minute break. Is that okay with everyone? Sorry, I know you do usually have a longer break, but I didn't want to. It was such an interesting conversation, and yeah, as long as I've got time to get coffee and a banana, I think I'm probably okay. So hopefully that's okay. So we'll see you back here in 5 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right.
Okay. I'm hoping everyone's back, and yes, we will move on to the second part of our session today, and I would like to welcome my lovely colleague, Kelly Garton, Dr. Kelly Garton from the School of Population Health, who is here to talk trade and health. So kia ora, Kelly. Welcome. Thank you for being with us today.
Kia ora, Suzanne. Thank you. Let me just share my slides and we'll get started without much delay because I know we're going to be tight on time today. Just give me 1 second. Oh, a little bit slow. Please bear with me. Okay. Is that showing up all right for you? Wonderful. Okay, yes. So as Suzanne mentioned, today we'll be talking about health and trade, and I work specifically on public health, nutrition, and food systems. So we will have a bit of that lens coming through. But I would like to give more of an overall view of some of the intersections between international trade and investment. Main points today that I'd like you to take home is that really the neoliberal trade project has disadvantaged public health, and the undermining of public health runs against our economic objectives. But there is a better way, and reimagining how we do international trade and investment can improve coherence between different sectors, including public health and economic objectives, with win-win outcomes. So the objective for today being between international trade policy and policies for health, with a focus on food systems and nutrition, and being able to critically assess this policy coherence or identify incoherence between economic, agricultural, health, and environmental sectors, for example. And also thinking about strategies to mitigate or improve the impacts of trade and investment policy on health, and in doing so, often also the environment. So I won't spend too much time on the background, but this is the general plan for today. And just to give you a bit of my own background, I'm a senior research fellow in the School of Population Health, as Suzanne mentioned, and my research looks at how globally trade affects population health and health equity and inequalities, with a special focus on food, because unhealthy diets are one of the biggest contributors to poor health globally. So I study how to transition to healthier and more sustainable food systems to prevent dietary diseases, including what are the barriers to doing so. And in terms of theoretical foundations, this comes back to a health geography sort of lens, looking at how place affects our health and well-being, because health isn't just about our individual genetics or our personal lifestyle choices and behaviors. It's really affected by our family and our community environments, the society we grow up in, and it's affected by our physical environments, both in the immediate sense and as part of global systems and processes. So it's about looking at health holistically, and this aligns with various schools of thought and worldviews, particularly Indigenous worldviews, but a useful global framework to bear in mind are the Sustainable Development Goals. And as you know, these cover a broad range of objectives, including poverty, well-being, hunger and nutrition, water and sanitation, and so on. And all of these have the potential to reduce disease and premature death. And most of the actions addressing the environment and climate change also have health implications. So the determinants of health refers to these broader influences on human health and well-being. And so there are environmental determinants of health, which is how our natural and our built environment relates to health and disease. Think about climate and weather, green space and air quality, water and sanitation, and so on. We have the social determinants of health, which refers to how society, including things like poverty, inequality, healthcare, education, and housing, relates to our health. We have then the commercial determinants of health, more of a recent area of study and policy focus. And this is related to unhealthy commodities, the production and trade of products and services that are harmful to our health, like tobacco, alcohol, junk food, gambling, toxic substances, and harmful corporate practices. And then even more recently, attention has turned to the political determinants of health. And this involves issues around policy and power, because health is a key responsibility of governments acted on by politicians, but politics is this continuous struggle for power among competing interests. So again, my primary area of research is in these commercial and political determinants of health, because this is where international trade and investment comes in. So just to give you a bit more background on the commercial determinants, because it's important to keep these frameworks in mind as we're looking at these trade and investment agreements. These are broadly about the strategies and approaches used by the private sector in promoting products and choices that are harmful to health, but commercially profitable. And so one way to look at the commercial determinants of health is that they cover 3 areas. The first being related to the unhealthy commodities that are contributing to poor health, and the big ones being tobacco, alcohol, and junk food. But they also include the business, market, and political practices that are harmful to health and are used to sell these commodities and secure a more favorable policy environment. And then finally, they also include the global commercial drivers like market-driven economies and globalization that have facilitated the use of these harmful practices and the proliferation of harmful commodities. And the commercial determinants of health impact a broad range of health outcomes. And these are just a few that I've listed here. Some of these, for several of these, the main mechanisms will be through those unhealthy commodities. But for others, it comes down to how commercial enterprise affects our environments and our society. And a really important thing to remember here is that even though in public health, we often treat health and well-being as an intrinsic value and an important goal in and of itself, but it has an economic value as well. So the cost of the commercial determinants is significant. And even though it's generated by commercial enterprise, this is largely externalized. So those costs are carried by other actors and stakeholders, so either governments and or the public. So for an example, according to The Economist, a study in 2021, adult obesity is estimated to have cost the health systems in Brazil, Chile, and Colombia $28 billion US in the year 2020 alone. And so that's just in direct healthcare costs, which includes things like medical care, medicines, rehab, and so on. But then there's also indirect costs of these conditions. So we have lost productivity, things like absenteeism from work, reduced work capacity and productivity, and premature death, which impacts the economy as well. And then in comparison, if you look at tobacco, also a really significant public health cost. Another study looked at 8 Latin American countries that together represented over 80% of the continent's population, and found that smoking was responsible for almost $23 billion in direct medical costs per year, but then also over 16 billion per year in lost productivity, as well as another 10.8 billion in caregiver costs. So these are some significant economic impacts, but they're not usually being integrated into the actual price of products, and their harms aren't being mitigated in the way that they should. On the flip side, the evidence-based interventions to curb the production and consumption of these products are often cost-saving. So many of the most effective solutions to these issues are in government policy actions and regulation, including the examples that are listed on the right here. So these are featured as some of the best buy, quote unquote, best buy policies recommended by the World Health Organization for tackling non-communicable diseases. But these have been around for over a decade, and there has not been very much uptake or traction in implementing these known and tested policy solutions. Can anyone guess as to why we haven't had much progress in the last decade? It comes down to lack of political will, commercial influence, and interference in the regulatory process, as well as a civil society sector that's typically not well resourced to hold governments to account. So this brings us back to the political determinants of health, which looks at how different power dynamics and institutions and processes and interests and ideological positions affect health within different political systems and cultures and at different levels of governance, including the local, the national, regional, and so on. So thinking about the kinds of power dynamics are at play, and here particularly when we think about international trade and investment agreements, you have your sort of within country political ideological tensions, and then we also have the dynamics between the negotiating countries and those who will be engaged in discussion forums related to health regulations. And in terms of ideological positions, our international trade and investment system is obviously based on ideals of multilateralism, multi-stakeholderism, but the strong vein and underpinning here is also a sentiment of and a commitment to neoliberalism. So really favoring free market capitalism, deregulation, and reduction in government spending. So this obviously saw a resurgence in the 1980s and 90s in Western democracies as a preferred economic system, and this really seeped into a lot of the international trade and investment agreements that we're still using today. And as I'll show in my presentation, there are a lot of weaknesses with applying this ideal to especially trade in food that actually probably needs to have people at the heart of the system more than favoring deregulation and handing over more power to the private sector. So we'll come into some of these like high-level views of the interactions between international trade and investment agreements and public health, because it's not, there's no clear cut this is good, this is bad. They interact in very complex ways, but it's really important to understand some of the mechanisms here. So basically the rules that are contained in our trade and investment agreements are at this upstream level of determining our health environments by influencing what we consume, in particular those unhealthy commodities that I mentioned, food, beverages, including alcohol and tobacco, our domestic markets of production, including incomes, employment, working conditions, as well as climate and pollution, and then our health services and policy. And so these interact in ways that are both positive and negative on the determinants of health and health outcomes. So starting with the benefits, generally with an increase in economic development that we expect as a result of trade liberalization comes an improvement in the social determinants of health. So that's what we talked about earlier, our improved incomes, educational attainment, living conditions, and so on, which is expected to increase life expectancy, earning potential, and so on. And the facilitation and the movement of goods across borders should increase access to medicines and medical equipment, ideally, and intellectual property protections can also encourage innovation in the medical sector. In trade and agricultural products, this obviously affects what animal and plant-based food products we have access to in our food environments and at different levels of processing. And here, trade liberalization can and does improve food security and dietary diversity, particularly in nations where the food system isn't able to produce a broad range of products of staple foods. But the caveat here is that this benefit tends to be more experienced, by high-income countries, and where trade liberalization has been found to be linked to reduced food security and nutrition in many lower and middle income country settings. With facilitation of trade and services and foreign direct investment, there might be increased investment in health service provision, which may improve access or availability of health services. And then finally, with the increased movement of people across borders, this can boost the health service workforce. But important to think about where. So coming to some of the risks, some of the unintended consequences. Generally, trade agreements tend to result in fewer anti-dumping measures, more focus on cash crop production and animal feed, reduced domestic protections and supports for subsistence crops, and this can have a negative effect, a net negative effect on food security and the healthiness of the food environment. Overall, the evidence base tells us that entering into trade agreements and implementing associated policies is correlated with increases in imports and consumption of edible oils, meats, processed foods, and sugar-sweetened beverages. So these are some of the key, the most critical food categories that are driving our obesity epidemic and other non-communicable disease epidemics. So it's really important, the attention to what products are being promoted more heavily through these agreements. Again, so with access to medicines, intellectual property and patent rights for drug producers tend to keep prices higher for longer. There's some of this has been addressed, and certain countries can obviously grant import licenses or waivers for generic versions of domestically patented drugs, which helps to increase access. But I think during the COVID-19 pandemic, this really brought into focus how some of the agreed TRIPS waivers and other side agreements around pharmaceutical access, therapeutics access wasn't fit for purpose for the pandemic. And so this is an ongoing area where we need to be future-proofing for emerging threats. And then policy space. So the prevention of chronic diseases like cancer, heart disease, diabetes, overweight, and obesity, it requires regulation of unhealthy commodities, such as tobacco, alcohol, and unhealthy food and drinks. The history and the evidence has shown that the food industry, tobacco industry, alcohol industry, they like to promise to self-regulate and self-govern, but this doesn't work. So we really do need governments to step up and take leadership in this space. But all of these fall under trade and investment obligations, like technical barriers to trade and sanitary and phytosanitary measures. So there are several examples of health regulations that have been contested on the grounds of incompatibility with trade and investment agreements and the associated commitments. And so trade agreements can limit governments' policy space to pursue these health-related regulations for the public interest. And then again, in health service provision, there can be a mixed effect. So while foreign direct investment could be beneficial, there are also concerns that privatization can mean higher healthcare costs for users and inequality in access to care. And then with the increased movement of people across borders, for example, the health workforce, again, there's a mixed effect. This can create a greater freedom, but with unequal incentives. Sometimes we do see a brain drain of skilled workers leaving LMICs to work in higher income country markets. So looking at the global equity of skilled workforce availability, that can come into play. So the main thing to think about here is critically, the impact of trade liberalization isn't distributed equally across countries or within national borders. And overall, higher income countries, more educated individuals, higher income groups, and those working in export sectors are more likely to experience the benefits of trade liberalization, such as reduced food insecurity and child mortality reduction, while lower and middle income countries, people living in poorer households, less educated individuals, and those working in less competitive industries are less likely to experience any gains and more often suffer some health deteriorations. I wanted to come back to my point on policy space, because you're probably thinking, well, there are exceptions written into the agreements for providing for public health measures to be carried out in ways that support compliance with trade rules. So for example, that are not arbitrary or unjustifiably discriminatory or a disguised restriction on trade. So there are, and certain exemptions and carve-outs also exist for health purposes, like for example, tobacco regulation being carved out from investor-state dispute settlement in certain more recent free trade and investment agreements. The problem is an in-depth understanding of the interpretation of these clauses is often limited to a small few, and the justification of necessity that comes into place is evidence-based, and it's often very complex. The evidence is often contested, sometimes with even within the health sector. And the rulings of trade dispute and investment arbitration panels can also be unpredictable. So this reinforces a chilling effect on policy. You may be familiar with these examples of WTO disputes related to health policies. So I'm thinking in particular the case on Brazil with imports of retreaded tires. This policy, this regulation, like the others, was intended with a public health purpose. In this case, because imported retreaded tires were more likely to end up as waste, creating mosquito breeding sites. In this case, the way the policy was applied was deemed to be necessary, so in line with the health objective, but the way it was applied, I think in part because Brazil also had to comply with Mercosur, the way it was applied ended up being a restriction on trade, and it wasn't able to move forward. So the two top policies were able to prevail in the face of a challenge, and then the two on the bottom were found to be discriminatory in effect, even if not in intent. Usually health-related, there aren't many WTO disputes on health-related policies. Usually well-designed policy will prevail. So I'm not as concerned about WTO disputes, but investor-state dispute settlement is a whole other kettle of fish, as we say. There have been some very high profile and some very costly disputes in tobacco control, for example. And I'm sure several of you will be familiar with the experience of Uruguay pursuing single presentation requirements on tobacco packaging. And this was a recommendation that came out of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, so sort of a globally agreed good practice. But Philip Morris didn't like this policy and used trade and investment agreements, among other strategies, to try and block the regulation. So in this case, and in the case of Australia, who had also at the same time was implementing plain packaging of tobacco, all of the other nations that were considering this regulation promptly put this on hold and were waiting for things to play out in these ISDS cases. And that delay would have cost lives. But this has also been an important catalyst for policy learning. So after the experience of the ISDS dispute with Philip Morris, Uruguay and several other countries increasingly adopted health safeguards in their bilateral investment treaties. However, it's been found that renegotiating older bilateral investment treaties, particularly with wealthier countries, has been challenging. And it's also important to consider the informal challenges. So, for example, the specific trade concerns that are discussed in forums like the Technical Barriers to Trade Committee. This really interesting piece of work looked at STCs, specific trade concerns that were brought up in the WTO committee, TBT committee between 1995 and 2016. So 93 of these health policies were sort of challenged in this forum. The number of challenges was increasing over time. And the most common argument was in this unnecessary barrier to trade component. So usually arguing that a less trade restrictive option was available, and often considering industry self-regulation and consumer education as viable alternatives, which the public health evidence shows they don't work. The direction of challenges is also very interesting. So this study looked at alcohol health warning labeling proposals that were notified to the TBT committee. And they found that these were mostly coming from this smaller group of member states shown on the left, so mostly coming from European Union, US, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada, but also some of Latin America's bigger alcohol-producing countries like Mexico, Chile, and Argentina, and being defended by the list of countries on the right, those who have proposed or introduced stricter alcohol policies, all right, so including Thailand, the Republic of Korea, India, Ireland, Mexico, and South Africa. So Mexico was both a respondent and a defendant in this case. And looking at the types of arguments that are raised, so questioning the evidence, promoting a very high bar of evidence that maybe is impossible to be met in this particular area of public health, highlighting the costs of regulation, proposing non-regulatory alternatives like self-regulation by industry, and really deflecting attention, trying to descale the issue. In the case of alcohol, saying, oh, it's high-level binge drinking that's the problem, not your consistent level of drinking, which is also a myth. promoted by the alcohol industry. And so really it's strategically framed to hit these three areas that relate to Article 2.2 of the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement, concerning the contribution to the health objective, the potential impacts, and the availability of suitable alternatives. So these are, here we have these very strong neoliberal commercial and political narratives really undermining public health, and finding the TBT committee as an open ear, as a willing forum to hear these complaints. So we often talk about the concept of regulatory chill. And so this, I mentioned it in the case of the tobacco plain packaging and single presentation requirements. It's when governments respond to a perceived threat of a challenge under trade or investment agreements, and they might fail to enact or enforce their intended policies, or really modifying or compromising and diluting them to the extent that they're no longer effective or as effective. And this happens as a result of, again, uncertainty, lack of knowledge or legal capacity in some more resource-constrained settings, and particularly in these intersections between trade and health. I think a lot of scholars would say that substantively, the policy space is there to pursue all of these public health regulations if they're well designed. But it's the uncertainty, it's the threats that really discourage governments from moving forward. There ends up having to be a lot of political will to confront a potential challenge. So often they don't even make it to the point of ever having to defend a challenge. And this is also a particular problem in emerging areas of regulation, where the evidence base might still be building or emerging. And so it can become a particular challenge where we're trying to respond to new health threats or respond to new evidence that's really telling us that something needs to be done. So another example that I examined in my own research was around nutrition labeling and specific trade concerns raised at the Technical Barriers to Trade Committee. So this is considered a best practice public health policy for nutrition. And nutrient profiling models give clear thresholds for critical nutrients like sodium, saturated fats, sugars, and total energy. But early on, the food industry saw this coming and really didn't like it, and chose to use international trade and investment arguments to block this. So, and now these are rather more commonplace, so it's taken a while. But in 2006, when Thailand first proposed a traffic light label, this was challenged by several members of the TBT. And then the following policies that were notified from Indonesia, Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, Uruguay, and Mexico had to respond to specific trade concerns. So half of these resulted in some pretty significant delays while these technical details had to be ironed out and responded to. Two of them, so a quarter of them, were significantly weakened or abandoned altogether. And again, the technical claims really challenge the rationale or the legitimacy and the necessity, deviation from the scientific standards, which were set by the Codex Alimentarius, which has a lot of private sector industry stakeholders sitting in the Codex, not so many health experts, it turns out. So there was a real skewed sense of the evidence and the standards and what was meant to be applied in the case of nutrition labeling. And we have seen the tide change, and more countries are able to implement these now, following some great early mover examples, and particularly from Latin America. So finally, it's important to think about who gets a seat at the table when the negotiations are happening. trade negotiations are heavily influenced by private sector parties, obviously, who have a stake in their outcome. But they'll also also try and preempt this policy space for health regulations in the content of agreements. And this influence is rarely balanced by an equal engagement from stakeholders in health and civil society. So if studies that have looked at submissions to trade negotiations, for example, public submissions, there are significantly more submissions from industry than from health experts and civil society. They often, so these groups often lack the resources or the capacity to engage this way. Health actors typically aren't considered influential or legitimate stakeholders to be brought to the table. And adding to this, the general lack of transparency in trade negotiations can be a real cause for concern because health officials are often unable to see the final content of the agreement until after it's been signed. So these are just some of the overarching broad level interactions between international trade and investment agreements. I'd like to open it up for any questions before I go on a deep dive into the food system, nutrition, or comments.
I think
I
there is
know.
a comment in the chat
Okay.
from Ezekiel.
Oops.
Okay, John, if I may, I can just add a comment on my written comment. I think it's quite interesting, your approach. My country in Argentina, we're very aware about the intersection between intellectual property within the framework of trade agreements and the challenges in health. So in case of patents, we are very aware and we used to be engaged with the health authorities in a way to secure that, the generic industry will not be undermined for an eventual trade compact in terms of patents. So it's a challenge issue.
Thank you, Ezekiel. Yeah, it's interesting. I think the awareness of health issues has had a staged approach, and it really started with these issues around pharmaceuticals and patents. Health services and privatization became a concern. Tobacco control really took the stage sort of in the early 2000s. And it's only more recently that the impacts in alcohol and food and health have come more to the forefront. So it's just really great to see if there are cases where the health ministry and trade ministries are already working together. I think that already sets us up really nicely for deepening that engagement and breaking down some of those silos. So yeah, thank you for sharing.
And if I may, my written comment was in the sense that taking into consideration that you brought the case of Uruguay in the ASDS with Philip Morris, there's a broad consensus in many international fora about the necessity of having a multilateral framework, regulatory framework for investments, and to secure the right of regulated states in terms of achieving or pursuing legitimate policy goals like protecting health in a way that may be seen as threatening potential investor.
Yeah, thank you. And I think even to push on that a bit further, and I've been involved in a project that's been examining innovation in this interaction between health and trade and investment in particular. There is some movement towards actually putting in health-related requirements. So rather than increasing safeguards and protecting policy space, there's also a movement towards actually trying to integrate requirements on investors to create a more health-promoting environment. And I think that's really interesting to look at as well. I'll briefly touch on that towards the end. but it'd be good to have your thoughts on that at the end of the lecture. So thank you. All right, so I'll do my deep dive into the food system at this stage. And because I study this, this is my own area of passion. I hope I won't take too long. This is just a really helpful framework that a colleague of mine put together, looking at the different mechanisms through which our agreement content was changing the food environment. So that is the access, the availability, the affordability, and the nutrient content of the different food and beverages in our food system. And so we'll just go through some of the key mechanisms here. So by eliminating tariffs and non-tariff barriers like quotas, embargoes, bans, and sanctions, and so on, we're aiming to stimulate trade in goods, which is generally good for the economy, but we do see accelerated rates of food imports, particularly for animal products. Staple commodities like corn and soybean, animal feed grains, and highly processed foods, which are energy dense and nutrient poor. So not great for population nutrition, but also this greater level of processing means that they have a higher environmental footprint. With lower animal feed prices, domestic meat production typically increases, and this results in increased availability and lower retail prices for meats and highly processed foods. So again, these are meat products and highly processed foods are strongly linked to cardiovascular disease, several cancers, and diabetes, overweight and obesity, and so on. And then, yeah, and by that token, increased consumption of animal products and highly processed foods. So this pathway carries both environmental and climate change impacts as well as health implications. So for example, lots of studies have looked at the impact of lower tariffs on beverages, on sugar-sweetened beverages. So for example, in lower and middle income countries, a 1% decrease in tariffs on sugar-sweetened beverages was associated with a 3% increase in imports of these products. And for every 10% increase in the imports, this translates to an extra third of a liter per person in sales. Now, that might seem small on an individual scale, but at a population scale, this does have an impact on several conditions like diabetes, overweight and obesity, and cardiovascular disease. So these studies have particularly looked at how trade liberalization has facilitated the growth and consumption in the ultra-processed beverage market, for example. And now the other side of that will be in trade and services and foreign direct investment. So this favors a more favorable investment climate, by granting equal rights to foreign and domestic investors, greater protection of IP rights, and so on. This is accompanied by increased vertical investment by foreign food companies in the food supply chain, from agricultural production to food processing, retail, and advertising. And this type of vertical investment does create efficiencies from an economic point of view, but it also acts to consolidate market share and power among the major companies in the food system, giving them greater influence in political and regulatory systems. This has also been observed in the soft drink market. Most recently, I think the study that looked at this was comparing Bolivia and Peru after joining a particular trade agreement with the United States. And so after joining the agreement, this was associated with a particular increased investment in the beverage sector that translated into increased consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages. So this also tends to result in increased availability, affordability, and advertisement, particularly of highly processed foods. which generate high profit margins, as well as more aggressive advertising and promotion of these products. And particularly in lower or middle income countries where these markets are generally less developed than in high income countries, you see a dramatic increase in the availability, affordability, and promotion of ultra-processed foods. So the overall, it's said that the impact of foreign direct investment in food processing actually far outweighs the impact of trade in goods of these products. And then moving on to our domestic protections and supports. Through this pathway, countries have less of an ability to implement domestic agricultural supports, right? So direct agricultural production or export subsidies are prohibited through the WTO under the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures, but there is inequity in its application, and domestic agricultural support mechanisms in higher income countries such as the US, including subsidies that are designed to promote exports, are widely believed to have really distorted global agricultural markets. It's also been said that tariffs and domestic subsidies do play an important role in the income earning capacity of communities. So this affects food affordability as well. So generally, reducing this support for domestic subsistence crops has a net negative impact on food security in many countries. And I'll move on finally to this policy space and governance component. So I mentioned this earlier, it relates to the freedom that governments have left to pursue domestic policies for public health purposes, given the binding commitments that they've made in trade and investment agreements. As I also said, this usually we do have substantive policy space to implement these regulations. The problem comes in where the policy process is affected and the whole kind of structure of decision making is affected by skewing interests both in trade discussion forums and internally within governments to be more reluctant to pass these. So yeah, I guess as I mentioned before, in cases where there might be lower legal capacity to interpret the actual policy space, or just not being able to front the potential cost of a dispute, that might be enough to deter a country or a government from implementing the regulation. And I've heard examples of countries in the Caribbean, for example, where they were just like, we're not going to be able to do this politically right now. It's just not going to happen because of some of those trade-offs. So these are some of the potentially affected areas of food environment regulation, particularly. And so this relates to our taxes, fiscal policies, labeling, which we've already seen has been heavily debated in trade forums, restriction on advertising and marketing of ultra-processed foods, as well as looking at nutrient composition standards, limiting sodium content and so on. I know this has also come up in the Technical Barriers to Trade Committee. I think it is in relation to regulation in Colombia, as well as things like product bans, restrictions on cheap imports of fatty meat cuts in the Pacific was a key debate in the early 2000s as well. For example, with Fiji and Samoa wanting to limit those cheap cuts coming from New Zealand and the United States that were really tied to some of the dietary problems that they were having at the time, and having to give up these bans when they acceded to the WTO because this just wasn't compatible with those agreements. So I want to pull all of this together and talk about, again, some of these key challenges in policy coherence, but also my recommendations for designing healthy trade policy. One of the readings that I suggested for today discusses trade agreements as potentially a triple-edged sword for public health in the way that they can be used by the more harmful industries around the world. So goods and services liberalization provisions that reduce tariffs or take away restrictions on foreign direct investment, encourage increased consumption of those unhealthy commodities that we've talked so much about, and typically increase the volume of imports and local production and manufacturing and distribution of these products, alongside very intensive marketing and advertising campaigns. And then when rates of non-communicable disease associated with the consumption of these harmful products, when those rates rise, intellectual property rights and protections in these agreements, which include extending pharmaceutical monopolies, they negatively affect access to treatment by keeping medicine prices higher for longer. And then through having this greater influence in regulatory environments, through agreements increasingly reaching kind of behind the border into how governments can regulate. And this is, through harmonization initiatives and investor-state dispute settlement and other trade forums, governments' efforts to then regulate the production and distribution of harmful commodities can be interfered with. So we have a number of competing interests and priorities. These are not necessarily mutually exclusive, though. There's quite a lot of complementarity at the end of the day between public health and economic objectives if the costs of the harms to public health are properly accounted for, if those economic costs are properly considered in these decisions. However, when we do introduce private sector interests and we privilege private sector interests in these processes, that does really muddy the waters of what our respective priorities are and should be. So key challenges include unequal power, both between member countries, like in a negotiation and in discussion forums like the TBT committee, but also within countries. There's unequal power and resources and avenues for influence between economic actors with health and other public policy actors who aren't seen as legitimate stakeholders in this space. So as a consequence, we tend to have an absence of the range of knowledge and values and agendas of the health sector in these agreements. So there's a delegitimizing and a deprioritizing of health that occurs like internally within the formulation of domestic policy, for example. We have competing interests and ideologies. So where public health priorities collide with competing national priorities for economic growth. We have competing ideologies where a belief in a limited state with an all-powerful market and economized citizens that underlies the neoliberal trade and investment agreements. This conflicts with a public health belief in the state as being the provider of public goods to all citizens in a fair and equitable way that should in fact correct for systemic market failures. And I think, yeah, unhealthy commodities is a prime example of this. And then the public health frameworks on the complex structural and social determinants of health conflict with the system and an overriding belief that success and failure or health and poor health comes down to the character of an individual, willpower, personal choice, that there's some real tensions there with what we in public health believe as being a product of our environment. In the technical aspects, within the agreements, we have this desire to harmonize our regulatory processes across borders for increased efficiency, and this conflicts with the need to design context-specific health policy solutions. So particularly if you look at the example of labeling, what works best in one place isn't necessarily the best option in another. And we need to preserve this flexibility to and to be able to adapt and evolve when necessary. And then the treatment of public health evidence within trade forums is another source of tension. And so it's this product regulation, the burden of proof to justify, for example, necessity in the technical barriers to trade agreement. You have to have strong evidence for the need and the expected effectiveness of a policy, which, as I mentioned before, can limit government's ability to implement more innovative policies to address emerging health threats. There's always a question of how much evidence is enough. And especially because this evidence will be weighed against counter evidence that's produced by opposing parties, including industry-funded, very purpose-driven studies that can be heavily biased, but strategically done to muddy the waters of evidence. And we've seen that in tobacco control, absolutely. The precautionary principle is there, and in some agreements, we've got it in SPS. It's probably underutilized and should be more emphasized in trade negotiations or fully exercised by governments wanting to regulate in the public interest, especially when there's emerging evidence. And then regulatory coherence provisions, like these aren't yet binding and enforceable, but I'm very concerned with the implication of establishing a national or central governing body with the power to review national governments' regulatory measures for compliance with quote unquote good regulatory practices. So the participation and perspectives that's represented in bodies like this would be really critical. And I think risks being skewed towards more private sector industry and multinational corporate interests, not necessarily the public interest. So how do we design healthy trade policy? I think the recent developments in the international trade sphere have really they've really solidified the idea that like we need multilateralism, we need cooperation. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. This is an English expression I'm not sure you're familiar with. It's a bit odd, but I am in no way saying that we need to drastically alter what we've been doing, but there are opportunities to rebalance the scales of public health and private economic interest. So the UN Conference on Trade and Development has suggested, for example, that international investment agreements include public policy exceptions. So for example, on the basis of protecting public health and having lower thresholds for the application of these exceptions. So for instance, instead of requiring that a measure has to be necessary to achieve the public policy objective or protect public health, text could just say that the measure should be designed to achieve or related to the public health policy objective. This substantially changes the nature and type of evidence that's required to prove necessity, and especially with something very complex like obesity, sometimes proving that causality is methodologically very difficult. I think these minor changes in wording would go a long way towards increasing the policy space for using these justifications. Investor-state dispute settlement is gaining increasing attention. So the example of the Australia-Peru carve-out, excluding health policy from ISDS, is an important one. The same way that tobacco control was carved out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. But my other recommendation is that if a health carve-out is going to be used, it should be quite broadly defined to include this holistic view of health in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. So I would be concerned about anything that is more narrowly written that could be interpreted in more of a narrow sense, which may, because typically the way health has been conceptualized in these agreements has been pharmaceuticals, health services, and to a certain extent tobacco. It needs to include this broader conception of a health policy purpose. As I mentioned before, several countries are doing away with ISDS completely. And we have this new movement towards investment facilitation agreements. There are an increasing number of health and sustainability related requirements on investors. Bangladesh was one of the interesting early examples of having corporate social responsibility clauses for all investors seeking to enter the country. There's some really interesting studies on this that I would recommend reading Tho, Alshner, and Al-Juniet, who have really studied the evolution of language around health safeguards, but then also these more, I guess, offensive clauses to protect public health. When we look at participation in the governance process, and in the context of a commitment to multi-stakeholderism, as trade policymakers, it's important to be aware of and really work to avoid commercial conflict of interest. There are opportunities to set frameworks for engagement with non-state actors to mitigate risk. So I think the WHO has a framework for engagement with non-state actors that it really explicitly sets out what is possible and what is not to mitigate these commercial conflict of interests. And consider the benefits of bringing health policy actors to the table in the design and negotiation of trade and investment agreements. I think it's really important. And then finally, increased transparency will help to bring some of these potential issues to light before agreements are signed. Finally, health can be at the forefront of agreements. So we can have explicit priority given to certain specified objectives like public health, social, human rights, and environmental goals alongside economic goals in the preambles to agreements. Replacing the concept of an exception with provisions regarding how different treaty objectives should prioritize things like health. And I guess just in general, all of this should include a focus on addressing the wider social determinants of health and this holistic view of health as reflected in the SDGs. So those are my tips. I have a point here on the emerging movement towards cooperation agreements and one on sustainable food systems that Chile has signed with the EU. I think this is a very important step forward in the integration of sustainable food systems and nutrition and health in trade policy and an acknowledgement that this is important. But in my analysis, the extent of this cooperation is very vague. And it still seems to be quite focused in promoting certain more sustainable products and practices, but will not address curbing the production and trade and consumption of products and practices that harm human health and the environment, such as ultra-processed foods. So I think this is a good early step, but we have a lot further to go. Now, this brings me to the breakout room activity, which sorry to have it at the end, but this made the most sense in terms of what I'd like you to think about, which is that you are advisors on trade and health as your government negotiates a new deep free trade agreement. It's really quite integrated. It has investment protection chapters. You're particularly concerned about the impacts of this agreement on the dominance of ultra-processed foods in the food system and how that could exacerbate health and environmental issues. I'd like you to talk about what would be your recommendations with respect to the terms of this agreement and the process in which it's been designed. So can we do 4 groups?
Yes.
Suzanne, Juanita?
Yes.
And we'll do 10 minutes and then a report back.
Perfect.
All
So
right.
thank you, Kelly. So I'm going to start to open the rooms just now. Thank you, Sus. I'm going to the groups to check if the slide, if they can see the slide.
Right. Are we all back?
Yes.
Great. So I would love to hear from each of the groups, starting with group 1.
Oh.
If you can just give me some key points that you discussed. And yeah, I hope everyone has like a report back person that they can designate, but we can hear from more than one person if it's quick as well. So can anyone share your conversation points from group 1?
I'm sorry, they are just here. So from group 1, we have Andrea, Eder, Ezequiel, Elena, Miguel, Paola. If you can share your reflections now with the main group.
Yeah, for sure. Please, if my colleagues want to add something, but I take some notes, I will say it for the sake of the time. We discussed about introducing safeguards to secure labeling in food products, the need of defining within the agreement what is understood in terms of ultra-processed foods, because each country may have a different approach on this. Also, we talked about raising public awareness on health and nutrition. Perhaps an approach might be to avoid the tariff reductions on certain unhealthy goods, or introduce specific provisions in a cooperation chapter to discuss and work on health and nutrition. In terms of investment, which was a specific element of the task, we talked about securing non-conforming measures, that is, things that the state may do without violating the provisions of the agreement, or without giving the idea that it's indirectly expropriating the investment of a foreign investor. And we also talked about securing the balance in terms of intellectual property rights and health. So in a way to find the balance between protecting patents for example, and having enough room to legislature to move on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ezequiel. Does anyone else from the group want to add anything? That was a really comprehensive set of strategies, and I like it. And I do think that we need to be addressing this in multiple ways instead of just kind of having one-off adjustments to text, or one-off clauses. Actually, I think having a health lens actually permeate throughout the agreement is going to be the most effective strategy. So thank you for sharing. Can I ask who can report from group 2?
So Colin, Enrico, Jessica, Jesus, Maria Carmen, and Wilmer Azura. So Sam?
Okay, I would like to start because, well, that my colleagues could add something if they wish, but this discussion it was very interesting because, in my opinion, affect us directly, no, impact our healthy, and to mix up all the idea that we discussed, I could say that the principles action that we would take as advisor could be to establish the labor transparency in trade agreement in order to show the right of nation to adopt and enforce clean and safe bags from a packaging nutrition labeling system. But the problem could be that we have to, I would say the word harmonization across the whole country, no? To unify this labeling in order to simplify the cross-border regulation, no? And to avoid this misunderstanding between that something that looks like healthy and could be done, or healthy or natural or zero fat or gluten-free, or all these conditions that could confuse the final user. So to promote regional healthy equity and reduce regulation fragmentation could be a good idea to implement across our nation. And especially to reinforce transparency, you know, I think this is the most important thing, to be honest with the user, and he could choose what I have to consume and what not.
Thanks, Jesus. Yeah, that's a really great point. Did anyone else from this group want to add anything?
Yeah, also, if Maria del Carmen allows me, we have also discussed about how to harmonize the technical requirements for these regional integration systems. I had the opportunity to be part of the negotiator team of Peru, well, from part of Peru in the Andean community regarding the labeling of cosmetics. So it's kind of hard to count on the competent authorities and define which items are going to be like standard for all of them. So for processed foods, it's even more sensitive. Yeah, it's true. Most Latin American countries have implemented this octagon labeling to identify which nutrient may be like kind of dangerous, or it's like or has a high level of concentration. So it's being hard for the exporter to adapt their own products to every market requirements. That's like an issue that every Latin American country or integration system should work on.
Thanks, Pia. I think personally, I think the use of stickers is like a great solution for that, right? So that it doesn't have to be like intrinsically on a printed label, as long as like the appropriate sticker is present on each product. But yeah, I really appreciate those insights. Thank you, group 2. And can anyone share from group 3?
Yeah, so group 3 is we have Beatriz, Marcia, Jessica, Ibarra, Carla, Nexabegue, Pericles, Virginia.
I think I'm gonna go this one. Well, I think that we could, most of us agree that it is very important to have a wide range of stakeholders towards the negotiation and also implementation of trade agreements, which can also include civil society actors and also academia. We highlighted that it is very important to have to make data-driven and science-based decisions in public policy nowadays, and also gather evidence and even prepare some very consistent studies that can back up the decisions or the positions that a country may have regarding certain industry or products, and also to revise very well the agreement and being wide aware of the commitments that are presented there, and well, maybe seek some kind of certification in some cases, but I think well, we can see that it is very important to open some consultations that could be formal or informal, but that can make this more collaborative, a more collaborative process, and also that it is more inclusive in some way. We couldn't, other colleagues could share their view, but their point of view, but this was based on some comments from my colleagues from Chile, Suriname, and Grenada.
Thank you, Jessica. No, great summary. And I think those are excellent strategies. Yeah, particularly focusing on that broader representation of stakeholders. I think that would have some powerful positive impacts. I know we're like coming to the end of time, but can anyone do a quick report back for group 4?
Group 4, we have Alejandra, Juliana, Gabriel, Kelly, Mariana, and William Cortez.
Sure, if you let me, I would like to start by mentioning that one could argue that the first question is whether the policy will be aimed at reducing consumption or production, and which would be more effective. Because for example, we were talking about labels, but consumers are not necessarily going to change their behavior in response to them. We didn't discuss this like that much, but that was like my main point of all the things that we discussed. I will let my colleagues to step in if they wish.
Yeah, for sure. It's more about the mindset, you know, in which people have.
I think that consumers, I mean, in this globalization that we live in, consumers will probably demand some of those products as they will know them already. So maybe not. I also thought about the possibility of not producing them, but I think they will always exist. So probably measures for complicating the commercialization within the country that is importing would be more effective. Like we mentioned at some point, apart from the labels, maybe trying to put some barriers that cause the selling price in the domestic market of that product would be high, so that it won't be that easy to reach.
Yeah, thanks, Mariana and Alejandra. I was able to sit on this group, and there were some really interesting conversations about, yeah, what we do with labeling, and that being like a very necessary but maybe minimum requirement is that consumers have accurate information about what's in their products, but that really price is a key motivator, and having to think about maybe using trade tools to try and hopefully manipulate at least the price structures between healthier and less healthy products, to see if that could be possible. Now, yeah, thank you for your engagement in the breakout rooms. It was really interesting to hear some of those thoughts coming out. If anyone has any questions or wants to talk about trade and health and food systems further, please don't hesitate to send me an email. I don't know if there's time right now for any other questions, comments, or concerns, but I really appreciate this group of scholars. It's been a pleasure to join you today, and hope we meet again.
Yora, Kelly, thank you so much for your presentation, and we really enjoyed it. And because we are running out of time, I'm just going to close with that karakia. So tutawa mai I runga, tutawa mai I raro, tutawa mai I roto, tutawa mai I whana. Kia tato ai, kia marutu, te mauri ora, ki te katoa, humie, huie, tae kie. So thank you everyone for sharing this time with us and allowing us to extend a little bit. Please have a good rest. Here we have Matariki tomorrow, so I'm not going to be there for the office hour, but we will hope we'll see you next week for the last 2 sessions of your course.
Thank you.
And have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
Kelly.
To the next time.
Thank you.
Akite.
Akite.
Thank you.